When the HOA threatened to take my home, I fought back, with a 10,000-volt surprise she'd never forget. It started with a simple notice in the mailbox. "Immediate compliance required," it read, stamped with the HOA's seal. Clara, my next-door neighbor, had always been a stickler for rules. But this time, the HOA claimed my backyard fence was non-compliant, threatening foreclosure if I didn't remove it within 30 days. I'd lived here for 10 years, paid every fee, and never caused trouble. Yet here I was, staring at a letter that could cost me my home. I called the HOA. The voice on the other end was cold. "Remove the fence or legal action will follow." I clenched my fists. Something told me this wasn't about rules. This was personal. Clara had always been a thorn in the side of anyone who dared step outside the lines of what she considered acceptable. To the casual observer, she seemed like a conscientious neighbor, the type who worried about lawn lengths and mailbox placements, the type who would smile at you politely before scurrying off to check her clipboard. But anyone who had lived near her for more than a month knew the truth. Clara's idea of neighborhood safety was a relentless, microscopic inspection of everyone else's life, an obsession she treated like a personal mission, and I had just become her latest target. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly, as most obsessions do. I noticed her car parked just a few houses down whenever I returned home, a beige sedan with darkened windows, but I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe she was visiting her mother, or perhaps she had errands in the area. But then it became clear that her presence was not coincidental. The visits were timed, always when I was outside. The moment I pulled into my driveway, her car would appear a block away. When I went jogging in the evening, she was on her porch, binoculars pressed to her eyes, a small notebook in hand, scribbling furiously as if recording my every move for posterity. It was unnerving, the way she seemed to anticipate my actions. She would appear wherever I went, sometimes pretending to water her flowers or chat with other neighbors, always managing to cast a subtle, judging glance my way. Her obsession wasn't quiet. It was invasive, suffocating, like a shadow that refused to leave. I began to notice little things, small scratches on my mailbox, footprints in my freshly laid gravel, the faint hum of a camera shutter clicking somewhere near my fence line. And then came the notes. Small, folded pieces of paper left tucked into my gate latch in my mailbox, sometimes even slipped under the front door. They were always about rules, regulations, or minor infractions that she insisted were violations. Grass too long, fence paint peeling, trash can placed improperly, loud footsteps at 7:03 p.m. Each note carried the same tone, an air of superiority, as if she were both judge and jury, ready to impose consequences for crimes that didn't exist. I tried to confront her once, politely, offering to discuss any concerns she had, hopping to appeal to reason. "I'm just making sure the neighborhood stays up to standard," she said with a thin smile, but there was a glint in her eyes that betrayed her satisfaction at my discomfort. That was when I realized this wasn't about rules at all. Clara didn't care about the neighborhood. She didn't care about safety, decorum, or even the HOA. What she craved was control, the thrill of watching, the power of knowing that her vigilance could unsettle someone else. It was predatory, and I was the prey. The notebook she carried everywhere was her manifesto. I glimpsed it once as she hurried past my driveway, the pages filled with meticulous records of my comings and goings, sketches of my property, timings noted to the exact minute. It was a dossier of obsession, and the more I ignored her, the more detailed it became. She spoke to the neighbors about me as though she were issuing warnings, whispers that slid through the community like poison. "He's defying the rules," she said one afternoon to a group gathered near the mailboxes, her voice low and conspiratorial, eyes darting toward my house. "He's ignoring the notices. You can't trust someone like that." I caught the words midair and felt a surge of irritation. Not because she called me out. What she said was, in many ways, trivial, but because she was twisting the truth, weaponizing my independence against me. Her obsession grew bolder as days passed. I noticed cameras pointed toward my yard, small black devices barely visible behind shrubs or attached to lampposts. Binoculars appeared on her porch railing, their lenses catching the sunlight in a way that made them impossible to miss once you were looking for them. She would stroll past my property line slowly, pretending to inspect her own flowers, but always with that subtle, calculated glance toward my house. Notes kept appearing. One day, I found 3 folded sheets in my mailbox, each with an urgent, exclamation-laden warning about violations I hadn't committed. "Please adhere to the HOA rules," they said. "This is your final warning." I considered throwing them away, burning them even, but the act of reading them made me feel violated, like a silent invasion into my private life. And she knew it. That was the most chilling part of Clara, her ability to get under your skin without ever raising her voice. She didn't need confrontation. Her mere presence was confrontation. She thrived on anxiety, on the anticipation of tension, and the knowledge that I could do nothing about it. Sometimes I would catch glimpses of her taking photos through her kitchen window, the flash catching in the reflection like a predator marking its territory. Other times, she would be scribbling notes while perched on the curb across the street, pretending to tie her shoes or fix her dog's leash, but her eyes never left my property. I began to feel watched everywhere, not just on my street. Walking the dog, jogging in the park, even getting the mail felt like being under surveillance. The notebooks, the whispers, the pointed fingers of other neighbors who had been subtly influenced by her words. Everything was part of a larger, invisible web that Clara was weaving around me. I started documenting her behavior in my own way, snapping photos from my window when I could catch her, noting times and dates, cataloging the ways in which she tried to insert herself into my life. But the more evidence I gathered, the more I realized how deeply her obsession had sunk into the neighborhood. Others seemed unaware or too intimidated to confront her. The HOA meetings had become her theater, a stage where she could parade her knowledge of everyone else's missteps, her voice commanding attention, her accusations met with murmured agreement from those too timid to question her. And yet, despite all this, she had no real authority, no official power beyond what she could fabricate in her own mind and project onto others. Her obsession was self-serving, a private campaign waged under the guise of civic duty. It was maddening because it was invisible in many ways, subtle, insidious, a psychological attack that left no visible scars but gnawed relentlessly at your peace of mind. I noticed it in the small things first: my mail arriving open slightly, my garden tools displaced, my fence paint touched in ways that seemed more observational than maintenance. Then the incidents became more pointed. A smear of paint on my driveway, a tiny scratch along my car door, a pinhole in the garden hose. Each act small, deniable, but cumulatively significant, a steady drip of intimidation. Clara's obsession had escalated to a full-blown campaign. She was always near, always observing, always cataloging. Her whispers to neighbors became more urgent, more frequent. She wanted me to feel constrained, suffocated, controlled, but I refused to give her that satisfaction. Every note I ignored, every time I carried on without acknowledging her presence, seemed to fuel her, intensify her scrutiny. It was a game she couldn't win unless I played her way, and I had no intention of doing that. What frightened me most was the intensity in her eyes, the fixated, almost predatory glint that appeared when she thought no one was watching. She wasn't just enforcing rules, she was waging a personal vendetta. Her obsession had transformed into a full-time occupation: stalking, documenting, whispering, plotting. Every day I felt it more acutely, a tightening pressure around my property, a cage constructed of her gaze, her words, and her relentless attention. And yet there was a strange artistry to it, a methodical precision that made it all the more terrifying. Clara wasn't chaotic. She was meticulous, calculating. Every move I made she recorded, analyzed, interpreted, and I knew deep down that ignoring her wasn't a solution. Her obsession would not fade. It would only grow, spreading its roots deeper into the fabric of the neighborhood, until every glance over a fence, every passing smile, became suspect. I had become the object of her fixation, the center of her world of imagined infractions, and there was no clear way to extricate myself. Clara didn't just want compliance, she wanted domination, the psychological thrill of knowing she could unsettle me, influence the community, and manipulate the perception of reality to suit her narrative. Every day, I felt her eyes on me, felt the weight of her notebook, the quiet clicking of her camera, the whispered warnings she distributed like poison through the neighborhood grapevine. And in that moment, I realized that my life had shifted from peaceful independence to a constant, tense negotiation with someone whose obsession knew no limits. Clara wasn't merely a vigilant neighbor. She was a predator cloaked in civility, a storm gathering quietly at my property line, and I was the inevitable target. I didn't want to fight. I wanted my home, but I also wasn't going to be bullied. For days I tried to ignore the creeping pressure, the constant surveillance, the passive-aggressive notes tucked onto my gate. But the truth was simple. Clara and the HOA had decided I was their target, and ignoring them only emboldened their efforts. It wasn't about rules anymore. It was about control, about crushing the person who dared to stand outside their imaginary hierarchy. I wasn't about to let them do that. The final push came the morning I found yet another compliance reminder taped to my front door, laminated as if they expected me to frame it. I held the paper in my hand and felt something shift inside me. Enough was enough. That afternoon, I made a call to a local attorney, a man recommended by a coworker who'd fought his own HOA years ago and lived to tell the tale. When the line clicked and I explained everything from the fines to Clara's obsessive monitoring, there was a brief pause, then a low chuckle. HOAs love to intimidate, he said, his voice confident, almost amused. But intimidation isn't law. They count on people feeling scared and uninformed. You have options more than they want you to realize. It was the first spark of hope I'd felt in weeks. After the call, I couldn't shake those words. Intimidation isn't law. It echoed in my mind like a mantra. That night, I pulled out my laptop, sat at the kitchen table with a cup of uncomfortably strong coffee, and began researching. Property law, easement rights, homeowner protections, limitations on HOA authority. I devoured everything I could find. Hour after hour passed as I scrolled through case studies, legal opinions, state code summaries, stories from people who had stood their ground and won against overreaching neighborhood boards. The deeper I dug, the more I realized how much power homeowners actually had when they knew what they were doing. HOAs thrived on ignorance and fear. They were paper tigers with loud voices and thin claws. But knowledge was armor. I read about the limits of surveillance, about trespassing laws, about how HOA members had no right to step onto private property without permission, about how any attempt to do so, especially for non-emergency reasons, could open them up to civil liability. I researched electrical safety standards too, not because I planned anything outrageous yet, but because some part of my mind had begun forming an idea, a spark of inspiration ignited by frustration. Voltage regulations, perimeter protection laws, deterrent systems used by farms and private estates. It was fascinating how much legal protection existed for homeowners who wanted to secure their property from harassment or unauthorized entry. The more I learned, the clearer my path became. If they wanted to push boundaries, I would draw a line so sharp, so undeniable that they wouldn't even dare to approach it. A line they literally couldn't cross. A boundary backed by law, engineering, and common sense, something they couldn't argue with, couldn't harass me over without exposing their own overreach. As I researched, I imagined Clara's face when she saw it, the way her confidence would falter, how her notebook wouldn't save her, how her binoculars wouldn't help her see over a line she had no right to invade. The thought was satisfying in a way I hadn't expected, but this wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about winning. It was about reclaiming peace, reclaiming privacy, reclaiming the dignity they were trying to strip away. I kept reading, my eyes burning from the screen's glare. I compared equipment, read manuals, watched instructional videos from rural property owners, and cross-checked everything with state electrical codes. The more I understood, the more viable the idea became. It wasn't illegal. It wasn't risky. It was completely within my rights as long as I followed proper installation, grounding, signage, and safety compliance. And I would, carefully, precisely, perfectly. I wasn't about to give the HOA a single mistake to exploit. Around midnight, I finally leaned back in my chair. My head hurt, my eyes stung. But for the first time, I felt in control. All the legal jargon, the technical documents, the homeowner protections, they formed a powerful shield around me. I wasn't helpless. I wasn't vulnerable. I wasn't their victim. Then the idea hit me fully, not just as a vague possibility, but as a plan, clean, efficient, defensible. If they were going to come after me, I'd make sure they couldn't cross the line. Literally. I pictured the system. A clean perimeter setup, fully compliant with agricultural safety standards, equipped with proper warning signs that would leave the HOA with zero legal grounds to challenge it. I imagined Clara approaching it, that infuriating notebook in hand, only to stop dead in her tracks when she realized she couldn't step an inch closer without risking consequences. She'd be forced to watch from afar, binoculars or not, completely powerless to continue her obsession. For someone like Clara, who thrived on intrusion, distance was the ultimate punishment. The idea energized me. I grabbed another cup of coffee and began sketching out a rough layout of the perimeter, measurements, grounding points, insulator placements, access gate positioning. Not artistic, just functional. I cross-referenced everything with state code documents I downloaded, ensuring the voltage parameters fell within the legal maximum for residential protection systems. I wasn't building a weapon. I wasn't building something dangerous. I was building a boundary they couldn't challenge without exposing themselves. Every detail mattered. The board could argue aesthetics. They could complain about design. But what they couldn't do by law was demand I remove a legally compliant security system on privately owned land. And once installed, they would no longer be able to lurk around my fence line, peep through gaps, or wander too close under the excuse of inspection. Clara's surveillance campaign would end the moment my perimeter went live. The thought made my pulse race, not with fear but with anticipation. Defensive, legal, unavoidable. They wanted to make my home feel threatened. Instead, they had pushed me into fortifying it. Around 2 a.m., with diagrams scattered across the table and code documents open on 3 different tabs, I made my decision. No more fear. No more being watched. No more silently accepting harassment from someone who treated rulebooks like weapons. They had drawn first blood by violating my peace. I was drawing the line clear, bright, and electrified. And the best part, there would be nothing they could do to stop it. I closed the laptop, feeling something I hadn't felt since this all began. Calm. A calm rooted not in avoidance but in preparation. A calm built on knowledge, planning, and control. Tomorrow, the real defense would begin. I hired a licensed professional to install a high-voltage electric fence around the property perimeter. Not lethal, but powerful enough to prevent trespassers. The decision wasn't impulsive. It was a calculated move I had researched, verified, and double-checked. The contractor I chose didn't ask many questions. He'd done this sort of installation before for rural homes, private estates, even a few commercial properties dealing with vandalism. When I described the situation, he simply nodded, an expression of understanding crossing his face. "HOA trouble?" he asked casually, as if it were as common as rain. I didn't even need to answer. The plans were drafted, measurements taken, and within 24 hours the installation began. The crew worked with clean precision, marking the perimeter, drilling posts, grounding rods, and threading the conductive wire through porcelain insulators. They tested voltage, safety switches, surge protectors, and signage placement with a thoroughness that made me feel strangely reassured. This wasn't a backyard project, it was a shield, a boundary, a declaration that my property wasn't a free-for-all playground for nosy neighbors and power-hungry HOA board members. The system was state-approved, fully compliant, meticulously installed. They even provided me with paperwork to prove it, legal documents I stored in a folder labeled Defense. As the fence went up, I could feel eyes watching, curtains shifting, neighbors whispering on porches. They weren't used to someone standing up to the HOA, much less someone fortifying their property with something beyond a garden gate and a polite smile. I could practically feel Clara's binoculars trembling in her hands as she watched the transformation from her window. She must have paced her living room like a storm in heels, waiting for the moment she could sprint to the HOA meeting and report that I was constructing some sort of neighborhood hazard. But the beauty was simple. Everything was legal. Completely, perfectly, undeniably. The fence was activated on a cool evening just after sunset. The technician flipped the switch and a soft, steady hum vibrated through the wires, a quiet presence, subtle but powerful. Not loud, not dangerous, not dramatic. Just there, like an invisible guardian wrapping itself around my home. The warning signs glowed faintly under the motion lights. Electric fence, no trespassing. Clear, lawful, inarguable. When the crew drove off and the yard fell silent again, I walked the perimeter, feeling the air vibrate with faint energy. Part of me expected to feel nervous, maybe even guilty, but I felt something entirely different: relief. A deep, satisfying sense of reclaiming control. My home finally felt like mine again. The next morning, Clara appeared before I even had the chance to brew coffee. I spotted her silhouette through the blinds, arms crossed, notebook in hand, determination practically radiating off her. She was ready to strike, ready to lecture, ready to gather evidence for whatever complaint she had rehearsed in her mind overnight. I watched her march up to the property line with the self-righteous confidence of someone who thought they were invincible. Then she leaned forward to inspect the fence, tilting her head, squinting, and raising her binoculars as if she needed to magnify her indignation. She stretched her neck, trying to peer over the top wire. Bad idea. The moment her fingers brushed the metal, barely, lightly, accidentally, she jolted backward like a startled cat. She let out a small, surprised yelp that would have been comical if it weren't so perfectly deserved. She stumbled, clutching her hand, eyes wide in disbelief, outrage, and most importantly, fear. I stood by the window with a fresh mug of coffee, watching quietly. It wasn't schadenfreude, it was justice, poetic, lawful, beautifully timed justice. She stared at the fence like it had personally insulted her, then looked around to see if anyone had witnessed her embarrassment. Unfortunately for her, I had cameras, good ones, installed legally, positioned perfectly, documenting everything. And the footage showed her not only approaching the fence but attempting to lean into my property line, just as she had done dozens of times before. Except now, there was proof. Visible, time-stamped, undeniable proof. She backed away slowly, shaking her hand, glaring at the fence like it had betrayed the sacred HOA code she worshipped. I saw her mouth move, muttering something that was probably far less polite than her usual passive-aggressive notes. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was how much I had already gathered on her. Weeks of recordings, photos, videos, audio from the small driveway microphones that captured her whispered gossip as she stood near my mailbox. Every approach she made, every threat she uttered, every false complaint she filed, organized in folders, labeled by date and action, as neat and methodical as her own obsessive notebook. For so long she had acted with the confidence of someone who believed no one could challenge her. But now, the fence changed everything. She couldn't cross it. She couldn't lean over it. She couldn't hover near it without risking the same jolt. And she definitely couldn't claim it was illegal, not when every part of its design matched state codes down to the smallest requirement. She retreated to her house, clutching her notebook, rubbing her hand, glancing back at the humming wires like they were wild animals waiting to pounce. And for the first time since this war had started, she seemed unsure, not defeated, not apologetic, but shaken. The fence wasn't just a physical barrier, it was psychological. It showed her she wasn't untouchable, that my home wasn't her playground, that her power ended exactly where my property line began. That night, as the fence glowed under the moonlight and the soft hum filled the quiet air, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: peace. The kind that settles in your chest and reminds you that sometimes the best defense isn't hiding, it's standing firm with something undeniable, unbreakable, and brilliantly legal. The HOA had pushed. Clara had stalked. The neighborhood had watched, but the fence, my fence, had finally pushed back. The escalation began quietly, with the HOA doing what it did best: weaponizing stationery. They sent letters printed on heavy paper, stamped with their emblem as if it were a royal decree. Notice of violation, formal warning, final warning, safety concern, immediate compliance required. Each envelope was more dramatic than the last, full of legal-sounding nonsense meant to scare homeowners who didn't know better. Unfortunately for them, I knew better now. The first letter accused me of creating a hazardous environment. I nearly laughed out loud. The second claimed my legally installed electric fence posed a threat to community harmony. The third insisted that I must disconnect the system immediately or face escalating fines and potential legal action. Every sentence was bloated with empty threats written in the kind of language used by people who believed formatting alone could replace actual authority. I read each one carefully, photographed it front and back, and slid it into the thickening folder labeled HOA harassment. It was almost satisfying. They thought they were intimidating me, but instead they were documenting their own downfall. Each accusation, each demand, each fabricated rule violation, they weren't warnings, they were evidence. Tangible, time-stamped proof of their obsession. Clara, of course, was the storm behind the scenes. I could almost imagine her hovering over the HOA president's shoulder, whispering suggestions, demanding action, shoving her notebook into meetings like it was holy scripture. Her frustration grew more obvious by the day. She stopped hiding her surveillance. Instead of subtle glances, she stood openly at her window, binoculars resting against the glass. Sometimes she even walked by slowly, deliberately, making sure I saw her scribbling in that infamous little notebook. She wanted me to feel watched, pressured, nervous. But every time she stepped too close to my property line, the electric fence buzzed softly, reminding her she would never get as close as she used to. And that drove her insane. Soon the rumors began. Whispering neighbors, shifting curtains, people pausing in their morning walks to glance at my home like they were trying to see danger hidden behind the walls. I overheard pieces of Clara's story while working in my yard, claims that I was unstable, dangerous, planning something extreme. She told people I was installing the fence to hurt someone. She told others I was preparing for a lawsuit and trying to trap the HOA. She even told Mrs. Lennox across the street that I was running some sort of underground operation. That one made me laugh harder than any HOA letter ever could. Her desperation was showing. The more control she lost, the more wild her accusations became. And the more wild they became, the more evidence I collected. I had cameras pointed at the street, at the fence line, at the driveway, the kind that recorded audio just clearly enough to catch whispered comments and muttered threats. Every time Clara lingered too long near my mailbox, every time she tried to provoke a reaction, every time she spit out another lie to a neighbor within microphone range, it was recorded, saved, backed up, duplicated onto storage. My evidence folder had grown from one little tab into an entire structure. HOA harassment, Clara's stalking, false reports, recorded threats, surveillance attempts, trespassing attempts, defamatory statements. Every detail was there, neatly time-stamped, easily traceable, but I never confronted her. That was the part that frustrated her the most. I remained silent, calm, collected. While she spiraled, I simply watched, observed, documented. The HOA expected me to react, to panic, to argue, to fight. But I did none of that. I followed the rules, stayed within the law, and treated every threat as another gift for my case. Their escalation only strengthened my position. And somehow, in all her fury, Clara didn't see the trap she was walking into. She thought she was cornering me. In reality, she was building my defense for me, brick by brick, lie by lie, threat by threat. One afternoon, I saw her packing her driveway, cell phone pressed against her ear, voice rising loud enough to pick up across the street. Even without audio enhancement, I could tell she was telling the HOA I was creating a public hazard. I watched her through my window as she gestured angrily toward my fence, acting as though the wires were whipping around like snakes ready to leap at anyone who passed by. She was theatrical, almost comically so. More interestingly, she didn't realize my cameras had picked up every word. When she caught sight of me watching, she stiffened, narrowed her eyes, and quickly walked back inside, angry, embarrassed, yet still convinced she was the hero of her own story. But anger wasn't enough for her anymore. She escalated even further. Notes appeared on neighbors' doors with her handwriting urging them to take action against the dangerous man on the corner. She collected signatures for a petition. She left a flyer on someone's windshield with my name on it. She even tried to convince the mailman to report me for endangering federal employees. None of it worked, but all of it was documented. Every rumor she started became another clip in my archive. Every lie she spread became another line in my logs. Every attempt she made to manipulate the neighborhood became another piece of evidence waiting for the right moment. People underestimate how destructive obsession can be, not to the target, but to the obsessive person themselves. Clara didn't realize she was unraveling in front of the very cameras she feared. She didn't see how her frustration twisted into desperation, how her desperation twisted into paranoia. She didn't understand that every step she took towards sabotaging me was actually sabotaging herself. Meanwhile, I lived my life. Calm, quiet, steady. Drinking coffee in the mornings while watching the fence hum gently as a reminder that I had reclaimed control. Taking evening walks around my property, nodding politely to neighbors who weren't sure what they believed anymore. And through it all, I kept collecting, and collecting, and collecting, because eventually the escalation would peak. Eventually the HOA would overstep. Eventually Clara would make one mistake too many. And when that moment came, I would be ready, with overwhelming proof of everything they thought they'd gotten away with. Finally, it came. The day I had been both dreading and anticipating arrived in the form of a formal legal complaint. Clara had filed a claim against me, demanding that I remove the electric fence and pay fines that the HOA insisted were justified. The envelope arrived at my door one crisp morning, the HOA seal stamped boldly in red, the words "Immediate Action Required" printed in a font that felt designed to make the recipient panic. I held it in my hands, reading the claims carefully. Intentionally endangering neighbors, violation of community safety standards, creating an unsafe environment for pedestrians. The language was deliberately inflammatory, designed to paint me as reckless, dangerous, and irresponsible. But I wasn't scared. I had spent weeks preparing for this exact moment. I had amassed an arsenal of evidence that would make any legal challenge crumble under its own weight. The first step was contacting my attorney, the same man who had laughed at the initial HOA intimidation letters and assured me that knowledge was my strongest weapon. He examined the complaint, nodding with a faint smile as he read through each point. "They've overstepped," he said. "Everything you've done is within your rights. Every safety standard, every installation requirement, every legal precaution, it's all documented and verifiable. They're going to wish they never sent this." I spent the next few days organizing my documentation into a meticulously ordered binder. Section 1 contained photographs of the fence installation from start to finish, posts, insulators, grounding rods, wiring, and signage. Each image had a timestamp, geotag, and cross-reference to the technical specifications. Section 2 contained video footage from my security cameras, showing Clara and other HOA members approaching the property, sometimes leaning dangerously close to the fence, whispering, gesturing, or recording their own notes, all captured on record. Section 3 contained expert statements from licensed contractors and engineers, confirming that the fence met every relevant legal requirement, that it was non-lethal, fully compliant with state and federal electrical safety codes, and installed in a way that posed no risk to passers-by or neighbors. Section 4 was my personal journal of harassment, documenting every letter, every rumor, every petty complaint Clara had made, all paired with dates, times, and supporting evidence. Even Section 5 contained my correspondence with the HOA, where I had politely refused their threats, requested clarifications, and noted their improper handling of notices, all of which would demonstrate a pattern of harassment rather than any fault on my part. When the court date arrived, I felt calm. In the sterile environment of the courtroom, the contrast between Clara's confident performance and my measured preparation was stark. She arrived in heels that clicked too loudly on the polished floor, clutching her notebook like a shield, her expression a mixture of determination and fear that I couldn't help but notice. The HOA attorney, a man who clearly hadn't read the room, began the presentation with theatrical flourish, speaking about the grave dangers posed by the fence, the distress to neighbors, the recklessness of my actions. Clara interjected frequently, pointing at sections of her notebook, gesturing toward the fence in the photos, painting a picture of me as some kind of neighborhood villain. But when it was my turn, I calmly laid out my evidence. Photographs, videos, and expert statements were presented systematically. I walked the judge through the installation process, highlighted compliance with every safety standard, and explained the steps taken to ensure the fence posed zero risk to the public. I even included audio recordings of Clara whispering complaints and encouraging neighbors to fear me, demonstrating that the real threat to the community was not my legally installed fence but her obsessive behavior. The courtroom fell into a silence that was palpable. Clara's face flickered with disbelief as the weight of undeniable proof landed in front of her. The more she attempted to argue, the more my evidence countered each claim. Intentionally endangered neighbors. I said calmly, pointing to the expert statements. This fence meets all legal safety standards. All signage is visible. All voltage levels are within state limits. There is no endangerment. There is, however, a documented pattern of harassment and intimidation by the claimant. The judge flipped through the binder, examining photographs, videos, and certified letters. Questions were asked, and I answered precisely, with clarity and restraint, never raising my voice, never appearing flustered. Each point Clara tried to make dissolved under the weight of facts. The courtroom transcript would later show several moments where the judge paused, reading through emails and notes, clearly impressed by the meticulous documentation. The evidence presented by the defendant demonstrates full compliance with state and local safety regulations, the judge finally stated. Additionally, there is significant documentation of complaints and behavior by the plaintiff that indicate harassment rather than a legitimate safety concern. The claim against the defendant is hereby dismissed. All fines and demands are null and void. Clara's jaw went slack. Her notebook dropped from her hands onto the polished courtroom floor. For a moment, she just stared, blinking as if the world had suddenly shifted beneath her feet. She had spent weeks orchestrating her campaign, believing that she could intimidate and manipulate, never realizing that every move she made had been recorded, documented, and cataloged for precisely this purpose. As I packed up my binder, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. Justice had not only been served but had been done so efficiently, decisively, and incontrovertibly. The HOA's power had been challenged and exposed for the hollow, bureaucratic theater it was. Clara's obsession, intended to intimidate, had become the cornerstone of my defense. Every accusation she made, every whisper she spread, every rumor she circulated, all of it had contributed to her undoing. The case ended not with drama, not with vengeance, but with clarity and undeniable proof. I had followed the law. I had followed every safety standard. I had remained calm while the storm raged. And when the gavel fell, the court made it clear. The only wrongdoing in this scenario had been the obsessive behavior of a neighbor consumed by control and envy, and the attempts of an HOA to wield authority beyond its bounds. I walked out of the courthouse quietly, my binder in hand, my mind calm, my home waiting for me. Clara stayed behind, arguing with her attorney in frustrated whispers, still unable to comprehend that her own actions had cemented her failure. For the first time in months, I felt the kind of victory that doesn't need celebration, just peace, validation, and the knowledge that standing firm, documenting every step, and remaining within the law had protected what mattered most: my home, my privacy, and my dignity. The courtroom was heavy with tension, a quiet pressure that pressed down on every seat, every polished surface, and every set of eyes in attendance. Clara sat rigidly in the front row, her notebook clutched like a lifeline, fingers tapping nervously against its cover, eyes darting between the judge, the court clerk, and anyone in the room who dared glance at her. Her face was tight, the forced composure barely masking the storm of frustration and disbelief swirling behind her eyes. I sat with my attorney beside me, calm, collected, My own folder of documentation spread neatly on the table before us, organized with meticulous precision, each page, photo, and recording indexed for immediate reference. My attorney stood, clearing his throat, and addressed the judge in a tone of measured authority that carried both clarity and confidence. "Your Honor, my client has every right to protect his property," he began, his voice resonating across the courtroom. "Every decision made regarding the installation of the electric fence, the security measures, and the documentation of harassment is fully compliant with state and local law. The plaintiff has filed numerous complaints that are either invalid, exaggerated, or entirely fabricated, creating a pattern of harassment, intimidation, and undue stress against my client. These actions have resulted in substantial emotional distress and legal fees for my client, all of which are well documented." The judge, a stern-looking woman with a keen eye for detail, leaned forward slightly, flipping through the thick stack of documents we had submitted prior to the hearing. Each page was examined carefully. Photographs of the fence, timestamps on surveillance footage, expert statements, copies of letters from the HOA, and the detailed record of Clara's repeated attempts to provoke and intimidate. Clara's fingers tightened around her notebook, paper crumpling slightly under her grip, and her mouth opened and closed as if she wanted to argue, but the weight of the evidence made her pause. She tried, intermittently, to interject with small protests, murmuring that the fence was dangerous or that the notices were legitimate, but each attempt was countered immediately by my attorney's calm, precise responses. "Your Honor," he continued, gesturing toward the photographs of the fence, "as you can see, the fence is not lethal. It meets every safety standard, and it is clearly marked with appropriate warning signs. Any approach beyond the property line constitutes trespassing. The plaintiff has approached the fence multiple times, often in clear violation of these boundaries, all of which is documented in the recordings and timestamp photographs provided." Clara shifted in her seat, whispering urgently to the HOA representative beside her, who appeared increasingly uncomfortable as the evidence continued to accumulate. The judge nodded thoughtfully, her eyes scanning the documents before her again. "It appears that the defendant has complied fully with all relevant codes and regulations," she said, her voice deliberate and measured. "Furthermore, there is substantial documentation of the plaintiff's repeated attempts to harass and intimidate the defendant. Can the plaintiff provide evidence to counter these claims?" Clara raised her hand tentatively, but when the judge gestured for her to speak, she faltered, glancing at her attorney and then back at the judge. She began a stammered statement, claiming that the fence posed a threat to community safety. But as she spoke, my attorney calmly presented audio recordings of her whispering to neighbors about alleged dangers and showing false claims regarding the fence. "Your Honor, these recordings, along with the photographic evidence, confirm that the plaintiff has repeatedly spread misinformation and has attempted to provoke a reaction from my client," he said. "This demonstrates a pattern of harassment, not a legitimate safety concern. The only danger here was the plaintiff's obsessive behavior, not the fence." The courtroom was silent for a moment, the weight of the evidence pressing on everyone in the room. Clara's face drained of color, her hands shaking slightly as she realized that her own actions, the very obsessive measures she had taken to intimidate and control, were now being used against her in the most public and undeniable way. The judge continued to review the documents, detailed logs of letters sent by the HOA, all of which were technically flawed or improperly delivered, timestamp photograph showing Clara approaching the fence, expert statements confirming the fence's compliance with all electrical and safety standards, and my attorney's meticulous notes correlating each piece of evidence to specific allegations. Each reference, each cross-checked fact, made Clara's objections increasingly irrelevant. When she attempted to point at a photograph, claiming that the fence was illegal, the judge simply held up a hand, examining the expert statements again. "The defendant has provided multiple expert testimonies confirming that the installation complies with all safety regulations," the judge said. The plaintiff's assertions do not constitute evidence that the defendant violated any law. The court recognizes that there is extensive documentation of harassment and repeated false complaints against the defendant. Clara's mouth opened in shock, but she had no words, no evidence, no legal footing left to stand upon. Her notebook, once her symbol of control, sat uselessly on the table beside her. My attorney summarized the case with surgical precision, reviewing the timeline of harassment, the repeated invalid notices, the intrusive surveillance, and the consistent compliance of my fence with state laws. Your Honor, he concluded, the plaintiff has not only failed to prove any legal violation by my client, but the plaintiff's actions have directly caused harm, stress, and unnecessary legal expense. The defendant acted entirely within his rights to protect his property and personal safety. Therefore, we request that the claims be dismissed and that any fines, demands, or notices be nullified. The judge closed the folder in front of her, looking over the courtroom with calm authority. She adjusted her glasses, then fixed Clara with a steady gaze. Based on the overwhelming evidence presented by the defendant, including photographs, expert testimony, and documentation of harassment, the court finds in favor of the defendant. All claims against the defendant are dismissed. No fines or penalties shall be imposed, and any notices issued by the HOA that conflict with this ruling are hereby nullified. Clara's face went pale, her fingers trembling as the gravity of the judgment settled in. Her eyes darted nervously around the room, realizing that not only had she lost, but the courtroom now bore witness to the full extent of her obsessive behavior, the patterns of harassment, and the repeated false claims she had tried to leverage against me. She opened her mouth to speak but was interrupted by the clerk, who directed her to remain silent. She sank back into her seat, defeated, frustrated, and visibly shaken. I exhaled slowly, feeling the tension that had gripped me for months begin to release. Every carefully documented photograph, every recording of whispered lies, every expert statement, all of it had led to this moment. My home, my rights, and my privacy were affirmed by the court. Clara had attempted to weaponize her obsession, but it had become the very evidence that confirmed my legal and moral victory. The courtroom, once thick with anticipation and anxiety, relaxed as the judge concluded the proceedings. People filed out quietly, whispering among themselves, some casting sympathetic glances my way, others shaking their heads at Clara's visible defeat. I gathered my documents calmly, folding each section neatly and placing it back in my folder. My attorney gave me a nod of satisfaction. I looked toward Clara one last time. Her fury and disbelief were palpable, but there was nothing left she could do. The gavel had fallen in my favor, the law had affirmed my rights, and every ounce of her obsessive energy had been rendered powerless in the face of careful preparation, patience, and irrefutable evidence. For the first time in months, I felt a deep, unshakable sense of triumph. Not from vengeance, not from aggression, but from standing firm, remaining lawful, and allowing the truth, carefully documented and meticulously presented, to prevail in the face of intimidation. Justice had been served, and Clara's obsession had finally met its match. After hours of tense testimony, meticulous examination of evidence, and the patient parsing of every detail of harassment, intimidation, and obsessive behavior, the judge finally reached a decision. The courtroom held a silence so thick it seemed to press against every wall, every chair, every person present. Clara sat, rigid and pale, her notebook lying uselessly on the table in front of her, fingers curled into fists, jaw tight, as if bracing herself for an outcome she didn't want to believe. The HOA representatives shuffled uncomfortably, glancing at each other with faint murmurs, clearly realizing that the tables had turned entirely. When the judge spoke, her voice carried the weight of authority, calm but deliberate, leaving no room for doubt. After reviewing all evidence, including photographic documentation, audio recordings, timestamps, expert testimony, and detailed records of harassment and false complaints, the court finds in favor of the defendant. The plaintiff, along with the HOA board, is hereby ordered to pay damages totaling $185,000 to the defendant for emotional distress, legal fees, and sustained harassment. The words hit the room like a shockwave. Clara's mouth opened slightly, then closed. Her eyes darted around, attempting to find a loophole, a distraction, a way out. None existed. She had spent months building a campaign of intimidation, yet every step she had taken had been carefully documented and catalogued, becoming the exact evidence that solidified her failure. The HOA representatives shifted uneasily, papers rustling in their hands, glancing at the judge as if hoping for a different outcome, but the decision was final, precise, and unassailable. I remained seated, sipping a cup of lukewarm coffee I had barely touched, my mind calm, my pulse steady. There was no gloating in my expression, only a quiet, almost imperceptible smile. This was the moment I had prepared for, the moment every phone call, every photograph, every video recording, every careful note had been building toward. Justice was not only served, it was electrified. Every attempt to intimidate, to manipulate, to bully had been met with patience, legality, and strategic documentation. Clara had believed she could control the narrative, but in her obsession, she had created a mountain of evidence against herself. Each whispered rumor, each accusation, each attempt to provoke a reaction had been captured, timestamped, and preserved. It had been a meticulous operation, one that required restraint, planning, and unwavering adherence to the law, but it had worked flawlessly. The courtroom atmosphere shifted as the ruling settled in. Neighbors who had come to watch, curious about the drama, whispered to one another, casting glances my way, some in admiration, others in disbelief. Clara slumped slightly in her chair, her fingers trembling as she realized the magnitude of the defeat. Her obsession, intended to dominate and control, had been completely neutralized by strategy and legality. The judge continued, her voice measured. The court expects all parties to comply fully with this ruling. Any attempts to circumvent or appeal without just cause may result in additional penalties. Clara opened her mouth again, but no words could reverse the judgment. Her plans, her harassment, her obsession, all ended in a decisive, unambiguous victory for the homeowner. I stood quietly, gathering my folders of documentation, each page representing months of careful effort, patience, and calculated restraint. My attorney gave a brief nod of approval, a silent acknowledgement that the work, the planning, the meticulous preparation had paid off. Outside the courtroom, cameras captured reactions, but I paid them no mind. This was not about publicity. It was about principle, about defending what was rightfully mine, about reclaiming control over my home and my life. The magnitude of the damages, $185,000, was more than financial compensation. It symbolized accountability, the recognition that harassment, obsession, and overreach would not be tolerated, even when cloaked in HOA authority. As I left the courtroom, I passed Clara and the HOA representatives. Their expressions were a mixture of disbelief, humiliation, and quiet fury. I gave them no acknowledgement beyond a calm nod. The law had spoken. Justice had been rendered. My home, my privacy, and my peace were restored. That evening, I returned to the property, walking along the perimeter where the electric fence hummed quietly in the cool night air. The wires glowed faintly under the motion lights, the signage clearly visible, a silent reminder that boundaries had been enforced not only with legality but with precision and determination. I sipped my coffee, standing beneath the stars, feeling the weight of months of stress lift from my shoulders. The fence, the documentation, the careful planning, all had culminated in this moment. Clara and the HOA had attempted to intimidate, to provoke, to dominate, but in the end, restraint, strategy, and adherence to the law had won. The hum of the fence was steady, calming, a perfect blend of safety, deterrence, and symbolism. It wasn't just a boundary, it was a declaration that I would no longer be a victim. Victory was mine, quiet, thorough, and undeniable. The gavel's echo, the judge's words, the dismissal of baseless claims, and the award of damages reverberated in my mind. Justice had been served meticulously, legally, and decisively. and for the first time in months I felt completely, irrevocably free from the shadow of Clara's obsession. I poured a final sip of coffee, smiled quietly, and watched the fence glow in the night. Justice had been served. Electrified. The neighborhood slowly began to breathe again, as if a heavy weight had been lifted from the streets, sidewalks, and manicured lawns. Clara became almost invisible, retreating into her own home, no longer daring to peek over fences or whisper rumors. The HOA, once a looming, oppressive presence, had lost the aura of invincibility it wielded for so long. Their letters stopped arriving, their threats fell silent, and the petty power plays that had terrorized residents for months dissipated almost overnight. I finally felt safe in my own home, the sense of constant vigilance that had shadowed me for so long replaced with a quiet, almost meditative peace. The electric fence remained along the perimeter, humming softly, a serene guardian against intrusion and a tangible reminder that boundaries must be respected and that sometimes, standing up for yourself requires both courage and creativity. It was not just a barrier. It was a symbol of resilience and preparedness, of calculated defense and patient strategy. I walked along the perimeter occasionally, coffee in hand, watching the faint glow of the warning signs illuminate the dusk, each pulse of the hum a subtle reassurance that my space was protected, both legally and physically. Neighbors who had once whispered about me, some with curiosity, others with judgment, began approaching differently. Casual greetings became warm nods, smiles exchanged across lawns, and even invitations to small gatherings in their yards. Some approached me hesitantly at first, still unsure how to engage after months of tension, but gradually, respect replaced suspicion. There were small moments of levity, little acknowledgments of the ordeal that had unfolded. One neighbor shouted over the fence, laughing, "Better not touch that fence," while another waved with a grin, "Looks like someone finally put an end to the HOA chaos." Their humor was light, but it carried an unspoken acknowledgement of the months of stress and the ultimate triumph of reason and careful planning over obsession and intimidation. I found myself reflecting on the strange irony of it all. The very tools of obsession that Clara had wielded so aggressively, surveillance, rumor, fear, had become the foundation of my defense. Every whispered complaint, every letter, every note in her notebook, all of it meticulously documented, had transformed into a shield that could not be broken. The legal victory had been decisive, but it was the combination of preparation, patience, and strategic foresight that had truly ensured my peace. Children played in their yards again without being startled by disputes. Dogs walked without their owners glancing nervously for the threat of another confrontation, and the everyday rhythm of the neighborhood returned, quiet and predictable, the way it had once been before Clara's obsession had disrupted the balance. The electric fence stood as both a functional boundary and a psychological anchor. It reminded me and anyone else that courage could be subtle, creativity could be strategic, and boundaries were essential not just for property, but for dignity and peace of mind. I often walked my dog along the edge of the property, observing the neighborhood in its renewed tranquility, thinking about the months of careful documentation, the calm persistence in the face of escalating threats, and the ultimate vindication that had followed. Clara had vanished from daily life, her presence reduced to the occasional glimmer of a curtain, while the HOA's influence shrank, no longer capable of enforcing arbitrary rules or instilling fear. I could finally breathe without calculating every step, could enjoy my yard without checking the windows every few minutes, could live in the home I had fought to protect without anxiety shadowing each movement. Life after the ordeal was quieter, steadier, and profoundly satisfying in ways that money could not quantify or power could not enforce. I felt a deep, enduring sense of security, the kind that comes not from external forces, but from knowing that boundaries had been firmly established, respected, and defended with intelligence and integrity. The neighborhood slowly resumed its casual rhythm, children's laughter drifting through the streets, neighbors waving across lawns, the scent of freshly cut grass mingling with the fatting echoes of conflict. And every time I glanced at the hum of the electric fence under the soft glow of the night lights, I was reminded of the months of patience, preparation, and vigilance that had led to this quiet triumph. It was more than a physical boundary. It was proof that standing up for oneself, when combined with strategy, creativity, and adherence to the law, could transform fear and harassment into lasting peace and security. Looking back, I realized this wasn't just about a fence. It was about respect, about boundaries, about refusing to be intimidated. And sometimes you don't just win, you teach a lesson that no one forgets. I took a deep breath, sipped my coffee, and smiled. Home, mine, secure.